Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Anatolian Dispatch, part of the Evolve News podcast network. Today, we'll be speaking with retired Colonel Rich Outzen, who had a long career with the United States military, but also spent a lot of time working at the State Department, either on assignment from the U.S. military or after he retired, working there as a foreign policy advisor. For those of you not familiar with this, within the U.S. military, there's a designation known as a foreign area officer, and this is the group from which are drawn our defense attachés, our political military affairs advisors, our security assistance officers working with the provision of defense articles to other countries, and also helping to work with the training programs that the United States provides. So Rich is someone who has a breadth of experience in the U.S. military because he also had combat tours both in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he worked as one of those POW advisors in both Israel and Turkey. So he has a lot of experience and he has a lot of ideas. And Rich, welcome.
Thanks, Ed. Good to be here. I appreciate the work that you put in to furthering American awareness of and analytical insights into Anatolian affairs and everything associated with Turkey. So I'm glad to be here for a conversation with you.
Okay, well, thank you. And so listen, let's just get into it. Unfortunately, we try to stick to 30 minutes because we don't want to overburden our listeners and viewers. So where are we? Where are we in the Turkish-American relationship? What's your perspective on where we are, how we got here, and where do you think we're going?
Well, it's an interesting time in the U.S.-Turkish relationship because there's not a lot of energy, for good energy or bad energy, being put into the relationship from the U.S. side. Frankly, I think that the Biden administration should be sort of considered Obama term 3 with regards to foreign policy. That's not my original thought, but I agree with it. And the overriding concern, so says Colin Dweck, one of my doctoral advisors, in his 2014 book, The Obama Doctrine. The overriding ethic of that foreign policy is do nothing overseas that will distract from your domestic priorities. And that means you don't try to create any new problems and you don't invest a lot of energy in leading on the solution of existing problems. Multilateralism, institutionalism, all that sort of thing, and certainly a due concern for global issues, global warming and financial trends and whatnot, but sort of a Hippocratic oath, if you will, in foreign affairs. I'm a realpolitik guy myself. That there is some good to knowing when to exercise restraint, but restraint as an overall policy, I have some issues with. Certainly when it comes to the issues I've worked intensively over the last 4 years, which involve Turkey and Syria and the Middle East, it's a little problematic. Why? Because it is basically comes down to saying, I'm not going to do anything because there's political risk in everything. So on the Syria policy, we haven't appointed a new Syria envoy or special representative to replace Jim Jeffrey. On Turkey, there still hasn't been a phone call from the president to President Erdogan. Meanwhile, the Ukraine's bubbling up and could break into a hot war. We're going to be withdrawing from Afghanistan. There's two right there, massive foreign policy issues, which Turkey has significant play in. So you might think it's worth a phone call. But I think from the perspective of the president, I don't know, he hasn't told me, but I'm speculating here. There's huge political risk associated with doing anything with Turkey, because on the one hand, Congress is very anti-Erdogan. And because of what our friend Soner has called reductio ad Erdoganum, if they're mad at Erdogan, they're mad at Turkey.
Right.
And what that means is if he's seen as bending over backwards to reestablish close ties with Turkey, he'll be seen as somehow coddling, I'm making air quotes here, coddling a dictator. On the other hand, if he plays brinksmanship with Turkey, and Turkey's good at playing those sorts of games as well, and gets into a crisis, that could distract and create costs and distract, frankly, political capital and attention from other priorities that the administration has. So that means what makes sense right now is for them to sort of ignore it and hope that Turkey doesn't make a lot of noise in the meantime. Now, you and I have watched this relationship for a long time, and there's been sort of this stair-stepping downward from one low equilibrium to another. Actually, in a way, this is a relief that we're at this place, because there's a lot going on, and as long as none of it bursts into flame, it's nice not to have a crisis that involves us in Turkey right now. You and I've talked before about some of the crises of the last 4 to 8 years. The U.S. support to YPG, the residents of Fethullah Gulen in Pennsylvania, Turkish backsliding on democracy and on human rights, clashes of interests, or at least approach in Syria as well as in the Eastern Med. There's a lot. There's a lot of things and then the whole Pastor Brunson thing. There's a lot of things we've been sort of at dagger points on. None of those are, and I didn't mention the S-400s, of course. None of those are crises that are peaking.
Please don't.
Well, I won't.
No,
because none of
those.
those.
Distractor, right?
That's right. That's right. I mean, these are all structural problems at this point that we've learned to live with, and because none of them are emergent crises at the moment, it maybe is a good time to sit back and do some analysis of longer term trends in the relationship. So that's kind of where I think we're at.
Okay, so let's take one of those that's maybe more emerging than earlier ones. I mean, as you said, some of them are structural now. They've been going on for so long. We've learned how to live with them. We kind of manage. We stumble along. But one that's kind of emerging is what's going on the border with Ukraine and Russia, and what's the role Turkey? Turkey was trying to play a role there, be supportive of Ukraine, got some blowback from our good friend Vladimir Putin, and so now where are they? And is that a possibility that if we decide to work in support of Ukraine, that kind of opens us up to having better engagement with Turkey? Is that where that might go?
Well, I think there's space there for sure that we are both interested in, and that there's sort of an overlap of interest that creates potential for cooperation. I'm not sure that's where the U.S. is going to go. If you look at what the little imbroglio with the ships, the destroyers that we were going to send, we notified Turkey that we wanted to have them transit the straits, and then we backed down. By the way, the Brits are now sending 2 of their own ships through, but Turkey was willing without a problem to approve the transit of those ships. Zelensky was in Ankara not too long ago. They've signed last year a major defense deal after watching what Turkish drones and other technologies were able to do against Russian-equipped forces in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. I think Ukraine, which had already purchased some Bayraktars previously from the Turks, put in an expanded order, and there's defense cooperation on other issues.
Oh, yeah.
Ukraine happens to make a few things that Turkey needs too, like they're very good at engine technology. Turkey, while it's become 70 to 75% independent or self-sufficient in defense industry and its main system, still has some gaps, and they can't produce their own engines for fighter aircraft, as an example, and they can't yet produce their own engines for battle tanks and main battle tanks. And Ukraine happens to have relevant technological expertise in both of those. So this is a natural partnership. The other thing is Erdogan and the Turkish strategic elite don't want to see Ukraine resubordinated to Russia. Having an independent Ukraine helps to do a little balancing game that the Turks are involved with in Russia. The Turkish-Russian relationship has been phrased by other people as competitive cooperation, and I think that's right. They hedge towards Russia when they feel threat from the West or from Western allied proxies, and Syria, of course, is the greatest example of that. But they hedge towards us when the Russians threaten them as well, and that's one of the reasons that the Turkish actions to defeat the Russian-backed mercenary groups that were helping Khalifa Haftar in Libya was so interesting. So the Turks have sort of gone toe-to-toe with the Russians, either directly or with their proxies, in 3 wars in the last year now, between Libya, Idlib, and Nagorno-Karabakh. So every piece on the chessboard that helps the Turks balance against the Russians is a net gain. And that's why I think they, among all the NATO members, are probably least likely to see the Ukraine cowed or badly beaten by the Russians. And that's why you're seeing more defense industrial cooperation, as well as sort of provision of advisory teams and whatnot.
I think all of that makes a lot of sense. I would argue that there is one country, well, maybe 2. There may be 2 other NATO members that care a little bit more than Turkey, though not a lot more, but they definitely care a little bit more. And that would be Poland and my old stomping grounds in Bucharest, Romania.
I can see the point.
We could tell the famous joke about the Romanian in the foxhole and then attacking German from the west and then attacking Russian from the east. But it works in Poland too. So having said all that, what you just said, where's the opportunity for the United States to move away from the more competitive, or to move, Turkey away from the more cooperative with Russia to more cooperative with the US, and I'm just going to say the West, to say NATO and the US and other kind of more Western democratic leaning powers?
I think about this a lot, and the question is sometimes phrased, what can the U.S. offer? What inducements? We've tried, both carrots and sticks with Turkey in the past, and people often say, how do you change Turkey's calculus, and how do you bring out more of that, the cooperation with us and the competition with the Russians rather than the reverse? And the truth is that the domestic political pressures make it very hard to do that anywhere. There are not a whole lot of direct inducements we can give. We're not going to give in on the S-400s, and at the same time, it doesn't look like we're going to go to the hilt with hard sanctions either. We're not going to backtrack on things like our stand on human rights and democracy. Now, there's a less direct path to do this, though, and that is to invest more heavily in some areas that are of interest both to us and to the Turks. Libya is a great example, where the defeat of Haftar's offensive against Tripoli actually opened the door for US and UN supported diplomacy that had been moribund because, frankly, the Emirates and Haftar and some of our other friends had been convincing Washington, or trying to convince them for a year and a half, that the best thing that could happen is just for Haftar to take Tripoli and then put an end to all of this. That was in direct contravention of our interests in multilateral diplomacy as the forum to solve the problem. Well, guess what? Multilateral diplomacy has now taken root. They have an agreement, they have a political process, and it all happened because the Turks drubbed Haftar's forces and drove them back from from the outskirts of Tripoli and Watia Air Base and places like that back to Sirte and Jufra. So now, having reaped the fruits of this diplomatically, Stephanie Williams, I think, was our diplomat who was leading the UN's negotiating effort. Excellent job.
Yep.
But it was entirely enabled by a Turkish military force, ironically. And the Turks knew that they couldn't take the whole country, so they were willing to take half a loaf. Why don't we invest some tens of millions of dollars, would be a good amount to start with, in the reconstruction of Libya, make sure some of those contracts come our way, and make sure that Turkey gets its piece. By the way, Egypt and Turkey now looking like they're on the road to reconciliation. I have some friends in Cairo that are telling me that the meetings have been substantive and positive, and they're both not contradicting one another on the fact that there is a sort of a reconciliation process going in. I'm very upbeat about what can be done in Libya. That's one example. Syria is a little harder, but that's another area where, look, there's a lot of Sunni areas that are under Kurdish-led SDF control at the moment. There's not a lot of stabilization money going into those places. One of the reasons is that we emphasized our stabilization funding during the Trump administration. How about an approach that provides some money for reconstruction or stabilization in Turkish-controlled areas, contingent upon them allowing that same funding source to be spent in the Sunni-dominated areas that are under SDF control. Now, there's enough funding, I think, to go around that we wouldn't need to ask for their permission necessarily to work in Kamishli or Kobani or some of the more heavily Kurdish areas. But in places like Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa, which are heavily Sunni, and I've seen polling indicating that those Sunni populations are actually fairly well disposed towards the Turks, having some Turkish-supplied companies or Turkish humanitarian aid, stabilization, even construction firms, things like that come in, can build some economic mutual interests between the two sides there, and frankly, build down the perception of threat that the Turks feel from that area. Now, until there's political pluralization in Northeast Syria, so right now it's sort of a monopoly run by the PYD and the YPG, the Turks will see it as an enemy. But that said, they don't see the Sunni populations of Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor as enemies. So I think there's a modus vivendi with a little bit of reconstruction and humanitarian assistance, stabilization, that can be done in those areas. And then Ukraine's a third. And we talked a little bit about Ukraine, but that's an area where clearly the administration's being very careful not to escalate and get into a direct military punching match. But even people very close to the administration are saying we need to do everything we can in terms of public messaging and military assistance. Not declare them a NATO member tomorrow, but to
Right.
do everything we can to build their capabilities. And there's a lot we can do with Turkey in that regard in the Ukraine. We, at a minimum, we should be consulting with them on all three of these things and on other things. By the way, one last point on this. Turkey's network in Africa is economically, diplomatically, and militarily is big and getting bigger. And I think it's pretty clear, I think between friends, we can say that since PEPFAR, the US has been very weak on initiatives in Africa. We're not heavily invested, and frankly, we don't care about it enough to be the big problem solver there. But likewise, we don't want China to be the big problem solver there. Africa, Somalia being a great example, is a place that Turkey is involved with and cares about and has some leverage in. So we should be working with the Turks in Africa as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a good friend of mine who also worked in Ankara, and he was in the basically the Security Assistance Office, which we call the Office of Defense Cooperation. He's now retired, like yourself, U.S. Army Colonel, retired. And I'm trying to get him to come in because I want him to talk about that. I want him to talk about the impact of Turkey is having in Africa and how that creates an opening for the United States to work with Turkey. You know, I'm not revealing any classified information, but when I had an assignment in Angola, of all lovely places, a message came out from the Deputy Secretary of State asking us to coordinate with the Chinese on economic development programs in country. I cannot believe that this was actually written by someone who I really admire. I will not say his name right now, but it was the Deputy Secretary of State in the first Bush administration. So there you go. You can try to track him down if you want.
Well, Mike Mullen once described China as a global strip mining corporation, which I agree with. And
right. Well, that's that, and it certainly was the case when when this came in, I went to the ambassador and I said, what are they smoking back in D.C.? And he said, Ed, he said, just follow the instructions, which were basically contact the Chinese embassy, go over, have a meeting with them, present the idea, excuse me, tell them that this is being done worldwide. Well, it's being done throughout Africa. All the American embassies are going in this week and blah, blah, blah. And then give us a readback on their, their response. Well, of course, what the response was, thank you for the information. Have a nice day. Would you like some more tea? That was it. I mean, they were thinking, what were these guys crazy? Don't they realize? So anyway, so hopefully I'm going to get him on because he can pick up on what you're talking about, because he basically was an Africa hand who got this final assignment in Turkey, and he is now working on U.S. development projects in Africa based on his prior experience. So I'm hoping to get him because it's an area that has just been dropped. We all know that at a certain point in time, Fethullah Gulen and his people, the Hizmet, were working very closely with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Turkey to get into African countries, whether they were majority Muslim or not. And they were setting up their famous charter schools and this sort of stuff and doing all that. And that of course fell apart. But what did not fall apart was the opportunities that the Turks saw. I mean, one of the things we always used to do is say, okay, where has Turkish Airlines just opened an office? And you could do it. You could just follow where they were opening offices in Africa. And then afterwards, you would see this uptick in trade. You see uptick in all sorts of things. So yeah, they could be a valuable partner. And quite frankly, the idea of telling U.S. Foreign Service officers in Africa to go and talk to the Turks about cooperative projects in Africa, wow, that seems to make a whole lot more sense than going to talk to the Chinese.
We've done it in Afghanistan for sure. When I was defense attaché there and during previous assignments, I saw a very high level of engagement. The Turks have also a high level of cultural compatibility. Afghans, including the Taliban, actually, or at least those groups sort of more on that end of the spectrum. The Islamists, all of the ethnic groups, the Pashtuns, the Uzbeks, the Hazaras in Afghanistan, they all have generally positive views of the Turks, and the Turks have carried out their part of the NATO military mission there without killing many, if any, Afghans, and without a lot of collateral damage. They ran hospitals and did training schools. for the non-commissioned officers and things like that. So this is the advantage where the soft power that you talked about a little bit, the soap operas, the THY and all like that blends over with state power because Turkey is more engaged. They're engaged
Right.
in diplomatic terms, they're engaged in economic terms, construction companies, but not just construction companies, and in military terms. Turkey has trained over 30 militaries since the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
All sorts of officers from Africa and from Central Asia and elsewhere go to the Turkish war academies. There's a little bit of tunnel vision that kicks in Washington, where we tend to think that because Turkey's got tense relations with a number of states that are important to us, like Greece and Armenia, France, and to a certain extent Israel, although with Israel it's a little more nuanced, that they're somehow isolated or that they're a pariah state. Nothing could be further from the truth. Actually, Turkey does have some bad relations in its immediate area, but has some very good ones as well. They've got access, and especially when you look beyond top level national leadership, they're networked in all of these places. And in some of the problem countries, again, like between Turkey and Egypt, I think there's signs of getting better. So our policymakers should not proceed. And I saw there was a recent paper, I won't name which think tank it came out of, but a recent paper talking about the end of precious, not precious, but lonely, and how Turkey should be isolated and how we should leverage that and put together coalitions to knuckle them under on a variety of things. I thought to myself, how detached do you have to be to think that Turkey, rather than the United States, who's isolated in places like Africa and Eurasia and Eastern Europe and so forth? There's a trust matter between us. We need to fix that, but we should not base the solution to it on this idea that Turkey is weak, fragile, or isolated.
Yeah. This brings us back to where you started, and that's Obama 3.0.
Yeah.
At least in foreign policy, you're not as you said, you weren't the one who came up with this idea. A lot of people are looking at this. Some people actually say that it's Obama 3.0 in domestic policy, but I think you and I would agree that no, it's a much more nuanced, complex, complicated domestic policy thing that the Harris-Biden administration is putting together. I'm sorry, Biden-Harris administration is putting together. So for Obama 3.0 foreign policy, you mentioned a number of areas where there could be greater engagement with Turkey. And we could leverage that maybe to have positive relationships in some other areas. But you also mentioned the fact that, let's face it, Capitol Hill, try to find a friend of Turkey, okay? In the White House itself, try to find a friend of Turkey. I mean, where are they? Under the Trump administration, there was a mix. There were people who were not really happy with Turkey, and there were people who were fine and understood that it was complex and it was difficult. And of course, there's going to be friction. Think of it more like a large extended family. Not every cousin gets along just as well with the cousins that you really love. I mean, that's reality. And so is there a chance that the current administration will be looking for opportunities for greater cooperation with Turkey? Or are they going to do, as you say, just kind of leave it alone, do no harm? If we don't get in, because it's not do no harm in foreign affairs, it's do no harm to our political capital in the US for the next election. That's the do no harm. That's the thing you have to not harm.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. But it sounds a lot, Ed, like you're asking for foresight and for risk tolerance out of the U.S. foreign policy system. And I think that those are two quantities that have been increasingly scarce in recent years. And it's not just with the Capitol Hill piece. It's, look, Turks are difficult for American diplomats. Not those who go there and kind of get it after you've lived there for a little while. It's really not that difficult. But famously, the Turkish language is constructed in 180 degrees out backwards from the American perspective, because you build your sentences agglutinatively with the verb at the end, subject, object, verb, rather than subject, verb, object, like in the Indo-European languages. And I've always thought that was a great metaphor for how Turks conduct diplomacy, because the verb's at the end and they kind of want to know what it is. So they're going to ask about the end state. People started asking me in 1991, 1992, what's your end state with the Kurds? And you know what? We don't do that. We have process. We say, well, obviously, we want a solution within the federal borders of Iraq. This was 1990, 1991, 92, and they're like, this is going to end with you helping the PKK. I said, of course not at that time. Well, guess what? When you look at where the verb comes at the end, then maybe you see there's a logic to the Turkish position. I don't think that this administration, if I view it critically, has either the creativity or the risk tolerance to be able to reach out in this way. Now, they said they were going to have a summit between the Taliban and the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. They floated the idea of doing it in Istanbul, and I think there may have even been a phone call on it, but now you can't get the Taliban to do it, right? Because in the meantime, we sort of muddy the waters about negotiations by making a hard date decision for a withdrawal of our troops. So if you're the Taliban, why would you negotiate under those conditions? You sort of know you're going to have a much strengthened position after the 11th of September in any case. So I think we're going to continue to try to risk manage in the Turkish relationship rather than to look for the verb at the end, rather than to have a sort of what I would consider a more ambitious or visionary. And by the way, I'm not saying we shouldn't occasionally talk tough with the Turks and ask for concessions. And I'm not saying even in certain cases that we shouldn't coerce them. Look, anybody who studied the relationship knows that we're in a mutually coercive relationship. We have been for 50 years. But you have to coerce on certain specific things, and there has to be far more cooperation than coercion. The release of Pastor Brunson was one thing, stopping Operation Peace Spring. These are things that were sort of reasonable asks that we had to apply coercive pressure on. But the other things, we get into this broadly coercive relationship, and then we have no of the sort of cooperative, broader programs going on. You have to constantly generate that cooperation. Otherwise, the coercion is all that stands out. And I'm afraid that in the current climate in Washington, both because we're distracted by domestic affairs, because Congress is in a broadly anti-Turkey mood, and because there's other things on the plate of the administration, there's very little bandwidth to see for the creation of these cooperative opportunities. You and I just identified 3 or 4 sitting here and talking. So when they appoint you Deputy Secretary of Defense or maybe Assistant Secretary out of the blue in a dark horse candidate selection sometime midterm, maybe we can get in there and do some good.
Yeah, well, I'm not too I'm not too sanguine about either your or my opportunities of having any sort of service with the current administration for all sorts of various and sundry reasons, which we won't go into. Although I think your chances are much better than mine. So, which leads me to one last question. Is there anyone in the White House now, or in a fairly, it doesn't have to be super senior, but a fairly senior position over at defense, particularly defense policy, or over at state, who might try to gradually kind of push this idea up the hill of looking for opportunities for cooperation with Turkey? I mean, you don't have to mention names because that would be bad for that person. But I mean, are there any people still around?
Well, I think it depends on how the interagency discussions unfold, first of all, because I think that process is important and personalities are important. Both of those are important. And sometimes good ideas actually do make it through our system, although it's rare. So, but I can think, and I'll name a name for you. I don't know how bad it would be, but I think Victoria Nuland, who is supposed to be, I don't think she's been confirmed yet, but she's under consideration for Undersecretary for Political Affairs, a very senior position at the Department of State. She gets Turkey. She has a balanced approach to Turkey, and I wouldn't describe her as a Turkophile. No, but when she was Assistant Secretary for Europe, I think that she was one of those people advocating for a balanced approach with Turkey, and that's good. And I do know of at least 1 or 2 people working National Security Council who get Turkey, who understand the context. Now, in all the cases I can think of, and I'd have to say in the case of the Department of Defense, I'm less conversant with who's in on the civilian side, but I will say we still have strong advocates for the relationship at U.S. European Command, and a very strong team at the ODC. But
That's
in
good to
all,
hear.
say again?
That's good to hear, because I mean, a balanced approach is what we need. I mean,
But in each one of these cases that I'm thinking of, that we do have someone reasonably senior, they are still dependent upon, or sort of hierarchically below, people for whom Turkey is at best an irritation, and at worst, something of a bête noire. So that makes me less sanguine, but they're there. The people are there, and under the right circumstances, if the right crisis comes along and the process is done well, I think we'll get to a good place.
Okay. Well, Rich, thanks very much. We've run out of time. There's all sorts of other things to talk about. I do hope that we can get you back, particularly as things develop, and because I think Sonair is absolutely right about this notion. I mean, he's not the only one who's come up with the idea. If you have such animosity against Erdogan, do not translate that into animosity against Turkey. And first off, why have animosity towards another country? What it is a question of figuring out how two countries can have a positive relationship that is mutually beneficial to the countries. I mean, it's about national interests. It's not about personalities.
That's right. We
hope. So, okay, great. Thank you very much. And really, I would, this was fascinating. It was a wonderful perspective to have, because it's very different from many that we have had here. And I really do hope you will consider coming back again.
Great. I appreciate it. And it's always good to join you. And I look forward to talking with you again.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
All right. Bye-bye.